He didn't even raise his voice, but somehow the entire room felt like it belonged to him. And that was the moment I realized I had stepped into a world I was never meant to understand. I stood near the edge of the marble hall inside the Moretti estate, holding a folder I was supposed to deliver, though my hands felt like they had forgotten how to stay steady. I was not supposed to be here, not in a place where silence carried more authority than words, not in front of Ethan Moretti. He was not looking at me at first, yet everything in him suggested he already knew I was there, as if presence itself was something he could measure without turning his head. People around him spoke carefully, almost rehearsed, but no one interrupted the quiet space he kept around himself. When he finally looked at me, it was not dramatic or sudden, just a slow recognition that made my breath pause without permission. He asked me a question, simple on the surface, something about the document I held, but the way he asked made it feel like there was more behind it, something heavier that I could not see. I remember thinking that most people used questions to get answers, but Ethan Moretti used them to measure truth. I answered him honestly, without thinking too long, because there was something about his gaze that made pretending feel unnecessary, almost childish. The moment the words left me, the atmosphere shifted in a way I could not explain. It was not anger, not approval, something far more unsettling, like silence bending under pressure. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied me the way someone might study a locked door they had never bothered to open before. I should have stepped back, should have reminded myself of every warning I had ever heard about men like him. But instead I stood still, as if stillness itself might keep me invisible. Then he spoke again, softer this time, almost detached, asking me to repeat what I had said, not because he did not hear it, but because he wanted to be certain I meant it. I did not change my answer. I did not soften it either. And something in that moment, something I did not yet have a name for, shifted inside him. The world around us continued as if nothing had changed, conversations still flowing, glasses still being set down on polished stone, but I could feel that something had changed for him specifically, something subtle but irreversible. He finally looked away, not because he lost interest, but because he was thinking, and that felt more dangerous than attention. I should have left then, while I still had the chance to remain outside whatever invisible boundary I had crossed, but instead I stayed, holding on to the strange quiet that now seemed tied to my presence. Ethan Moretti did not move, but I could sense that whatever rules governed his world were no longer entirely fixed, and I had no idea yet that my answer had become the first crack in something far larger than either of us. I should have left when I still could, but the air around Ethan Moretti made even the idea of leaving feel like something that required permission I had not been given. I remember standing near the edge of that marble hall, pretending to focus on the folder in my hands while every instinct I had kept pulling my attention back to him. He had stopped speaking to the others entirely now, not in a way that drew attention, but in a way that made everyone else naturally adjust around his silence. It was like the room had learned a rule I had not been taught yet, that when Ethan Moretti was thinking, the world simply waited. He finally moved, not toward me at first, but toward a side table where a glass of water sat untouched. It was a small, almost ordinary action, but even that felt deliberate, like he was giving himself time to understand something he had not expected. When he spoke again, it was not to the people around him, but to me, asking a second question, this time unrelated to anything practical, something about why I had chosen to answer him the way I did earlier. There was no authority in the question, only curiosity, and that was what unsettled me more. I told him the truth again, that I did not see a reason to say anything other than what I meant, because lying would only complicate something that did not need to be complicated. I expected him to dismiss it, or to lose interest, or to return to the distant version of himself everyone else seemed to know. But instead he took a slow step closer, just enough to close the distance between certainty and hesitation. His eyes stayed on mine, not searching for weakness, but searching for consistency, as if trying to determine whether people like me existed in his world or outside of it. Around us, conversations resumed in low voices, but they felt far away, like background noise from another life. He asked me if I understood where I was, not in a threatening way, but in a way that suggested the question had layers I could not yet see. I admitted I did not fully understand anything about this place or the rules that governed it. For the first time, something subtle shifted in his expression, not surprise, but recognition, like my answer confirmed something he had not yet decided to believe. He turned slightly, gesturing for someone nearby to step back, and without explanation, space opened around us, creating a quiet pocket in the middle of everything. I felt it then, not fear, but awareness, that my presence here had stopped being accidental in his mind. He looked at the folder I was still holding and finally asked me to stay, not as an order, but as if testing whether I would choose to remain without being told. I did not answer immediately, and that silence seemed to interest him more than anything I had said so far. When I finally nodded, I saw something change in the way he stood, not softer, not warmer, but recalibrated, like a system adjusting to new information. He told me I would be contacted again, and then, just like that, he stepped away, leaving me standing in a world that suddenly felt like it had rewritten its own rules without warning. I told myself it meant nothing when the message arrived the next morning, but the moment I saw the name Ethan Moretti on my screen, something in my chest tightened in a way I could not ignore. It was not a long message, just a precise location, a time, and a request that I appear without delay if I still intended to keep my word from the night before. There was no threat in the wording, no pressure, but somehow it still felt like a door closing behind me the moment I read it. I arrived at the address just after 10 in the morning, standing outside a modern glass building in downtown Chicago that reflected the pale sky, like it had no intention of revealing what was inside. I remember adjusting my coat more times than necessary, not because I was cold, but because I could feel the weight of what I was about to step into again. When I entered, I was guided without question to a private meeting space on the upper floor. The room was quieter than the rest of the building, designed in a way that made sound feel distant, controlled. Ethan Moretti was already there. He did not stand when I entered, and that small detail made the situation feel less like an introduction and more like a continuation of something already in motion. There were no other people in the room this time, only him and a table between us that felt unnecessary. He gestured for me to sit, and I did, noticing how he watched me the entire time without appearing to study me directly. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and I realized this silence felt different from the night before. It was not observation anymore, it was evaluation. He finally asked me if I had thought about what I said, about my answer, and whether I understood why it mattered. I told him I had thought about it, but I still believed the same thing. Truth did not change based on who asked the question. Something flickered in his expression, not approval, not disagreement, but recognition of something inconvenient. He leaned back slightly, as if adjusting his perspective rather than his posture, and told me most people in his world did not answer like that they adjusted themselves depending on who stood in front of them. I asked him if that was what he expected from me, and for the first time, he paused before responding. He said he did not know yet. That answer should have reassured me, but instead it made everything feel more uncertain, because Ethan Moretti did not usually operate in uncertainty. He explained, in careful measured words, that my response the night before had disrupted a pattern he was used to, one where people aligned themselves quickly to power or avoided it entirely. I asked him why that mattered to me, and again there was silence, longer this time. When he finally spoke, he said it might not matter to me at all, but it was beginning to matter to him. I did not know how to respond to that, so I did not try. Instead, I asked him what he wanted from me, expecting something direct, something transactional, but he only looked at me for a long moment and said he was still trying to understand that himself. The honesty in that answer felt more unsettling than anything else he had said so far, because it meant I was not part of a plan, but part of a question he had not yet solved. When I left the building later that morning, I could feel that nothing about the situation was settled, and for the first time, I understood that Ethan Moretti was not pulling me into his world because he had decided something about me, but because I had already begun to change something he had not expected to ever change. I tried to convince myself that the message would fade from my thoughts once I returned to my normal routine, but it did not. It followed me through the day like a quiet presence I could not name, settling into the background of every small task I completed. At the clinic where I volunteered part-time, I kept replaying Ethan Moretti's expression, not the words he said, but the moments between them, the pauses where something unspoken seemed to shift. I found myself checking my phone more often than necessary, not because I expected another message, but because I did not fully understand why the first one had mattered so much. It arrived again just after sunset, a second request, this time more precise, asking me to meet him at a different location within the city, a private lounge on the west side of Chicago overlooking the river. I almost ignored it, not out of defiance, but because I was beginning to feel that responding meant stepping further into something I could not clearly define. Still, I went. The building was quieter than the last, dim lighting reflecting off polished wood and glass, the kind of place that felt intentionally removed from the noise of the city outside. When I entered the private room upstairs, Ethan was already there again, but this time he was not alone. Two men stood near the far end of the room, dressed in tailored suits, their posture controlled in a way that suggested they were waiting for instruction rather than conversation. Ethan gestured for them to leave, and they did without hesitation, leaving only the two of us in the space. He did not immediately speak to me. Instead, he motioned toward a chair across from him, and I noticed something different in the way he observed me, less like evaluation now, and more like adjustment, as if he was testing a version of reality that included me. When he finally spoke, he asked me a question that seemed unrelated at first, something about whether I had ever felt pressure to change my answer just to make someone more comfortable. I told him no, because it was true, but also because I did not understand why that question mattered to him. He nodded slightly, as if confirming a theory he had not yet fully formed, and then told me most people around him would have answered differently, would have considered the consequence before the truth. I asked him what consequence he meant, and for the first time, he hesitated in a way that felt almost human, not calculated, just uncertain. He said consequence was not always punishment. Sometimes it was expectation. Sometimes it was the invisible structure people learned to live inside without questioning it. I remember telling him I did not live like that, and the moment I said it, I saw something shift in his expression again, not disbelief, but something closer to recalibration. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, and asked me if I understood that by not adjusting myself to expectation, I was already breaking something I could not see. I told him I did not think I was breaking anything. I was just answering honestly. That was when he looked away for the first time during our conversation, not to dismiss me, but as if he needed space to process what I had said without reacting too quickly. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, not uncomfortable, but charged with something unresolved. When he finally stood, he told me I did not yet understand what I was involved in, but that I would soon. And as I left the room that night, I realized that the most unsettling part was not his influence over the world he controlled, but the possibility that my presence was beginning to change the way he understood control itself. I stopped trying to pretend that the situation was temporary after the third message, because by then it was clear that Ethan Moretti did not operate on the idea of coincidence. The request came earlier this time, delivered through the same precise tone, asking me to meet him at a private office space near the riverfront before noon. I remember standing in front of my apartment mirror for several minutes, not changing anything about how I looked, but trying to understand why I felt like preparation mattered at all. When I arrived, the building was quieter than the others, almost intentionally neutral, as if it had been designed to erase any sense of identity before you even entered. Ethan was already inside the room when I was brought in, seated near a wide glass window that overlooked the city skyline. He asked me how I was interpreting everything that had happened so far, not in a casual way, but like someone trying to understand the outcome of an ongoing equation. I told him I was not sure there was anything to interpret yet, only interactions that did not make sense in a traditional framework. He nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. Then he asked me something different, whether I had noticed that people around him reacted differently to me than they normally would to others in his position. I had noticed, but I told him I did not know why it mattered. That was when he stood up and walked closer to the window, speaking without turning toward me, explaining that his world was built on predictability, on patterns of behavior that allowed control to remain stable. He said unpredictability was usually treated as a threat, not because it was dangerous, but because it could not be managed. I asked him why I was being treated as unpredictable, and he turned back to me with an expression that was no longer purely analytical. He said I was not behaving like someone who measured consequences before speaking, and that alone made me difficult to categorize. I told him I was not trying to be anything other than honest, and for a moment he did not respond at all. The silence stretched longer than usual, but it was different this time, less like observation and more like hesitation. Then he said something I did not expect, that honesty was not a neutral trait in his environment. It was a disruptive one. I asked him if that was supposed to make me change, and he said no. Almost immediately, but the speed of his answer suggested the question had already been considered before I asked it. He returned to the table and sat down again, looking at me for several seconds without speaking, then finally said that most people who entered his world either adapted or disappeared from it entirely. I asked him which category I belonged to, and for the first time, he did not give a direct answer. Instead, he said he was still trying to determine whether I understood the weight of remaining unchanged. That sentence stayed in the space between us longer than anything else that day. When I left the building later, I realized that the uncertainty was no longer only his, because somewhere along the way, I had also started to question whether staying exactly the same in his world was something that would remain possible at all. I began to notice that silence had become the most consistent part of my interactions with Ethan Moretti, more than his questions, more than his presence, more than the carefully controlled environments he chose for every meeting. It was not an uncomfortable silence anymore, but something structured, like it had purpose even when nothing was being said. When I arrived at the next location, a private space overlooking the river on a colder afternoon in Chicago, I was no longer surprised that he was already there. This time, he did not immediately engage in questions or analysis. Instead, he simply observed the city through the glass wall, as if waiting for something in the distance that only he could sense. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a different tone than before, less interrogative and more reflective, as if the question had already been formed long before I entered the room. He asked me if I had ever considered how quickly people adapt their identity depending on environment, and whether I believed honesty could remain unchanged when pressure increased. I told him I believed honesty was not something that changed, only something that revealed different consequences depending on where it was spoken. He did not respond right away, and for once, the pause did not feel like evaluation, but recognition. Then he turned toward me fully and said that in his experience, most systems, whether businesses, organizations, or people, were built on controlled responses rather than truth, because truth was not efficient in environments that required stability. I asked him if that meant he believed stability was more important than truth, and he looked at me longer than usual before answering. He said that in his world, stability was survival, and anything that disrupted it was either eliminated or absorbed. I remember asking him where I fit into that structure, because I was still uncertain what role I was being placed into without consent or explanation. That question seemed to change something in him again, not dramatically, but in a subtle shift of attention, as if I had moved from being an observation to a variable that required adjustment. He walked away from the window and sat across from me this time, instead of maintaining distance, and said he was still trying to understand that exact answer himself. There was something different in the way he said it, less control, more admission of uncertainty, and that was the first moment I realized he did not actually have clarity about me, only patterns he was attempting to interpret. I asked him if uncertainty was something he allowed in his environment often, and he gave a quiet response, saying it was not allowed, only managed. Then he paused and added that I was not responding in a way that could be easily managed. That sentence stayed in the air between us longer than anything else that day. When I left, I realized that nothing about my presence in his world was being resolved into a clear category, and for the first time, I understood that Ethan Moretti was not trying to control me, but trying to determine whether I was something his world had never been built to contain. I did not expect him to be there when I arrived, not because he had never been present before, but because something about the timing felt different, as if Ethan Moretti had stopped treating our meetings as scheduled interactions and started treating them as points of continuity in something already in motion. The location was the same private office space near the river, but the atmosphere inside felt heavier, not from tension, but from a tension that had not been there before. He did not ask me to sit immediately this time, and for a moment I stood near the entrance, unsure whether that pause was intentional or simply part of his thought process continuing without interruption. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but direct, and he said he had been reviewing everything I had said across our previous conversations. There was no accusation in his tone, only structure, like he was organizing information that did not yet fit his expectations. He asked me if I understood that consistency in response was usually considered a form of predictability, and predictability was something his environment depended on. I told him I understood the concept, but I did not believe it applied to honesty in the same way it applied to strategy. That answer made him pause longer than usual, and I noticed for the first time that he did not immediately counter it with logic or correction. Instead, he repeated my words slowly, as if testing whether they held different meaning when spoken aloud. Then he asked me a different question, whether I had ever changed my answer just to maintain comfort in a situation where truth would have created tension. I told him no, not because I had never been in such a situation, but because I did not believe adjusting truth for comfort preserved anything meaningful. He studied me for several seconds without speaking, and I realized the silence between us was no longer about evaluation, but about comparison. He finally said that most people around him treated truth as something negotiable, adjusted depending on outcome, and that made stability possible in systems that required control. I asked him if control was the only thing he believed systems required, and for the first time, he did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward the window, looking at the city below as if the answer existed somewhere in the movement of it. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, and he said control was not about strength, but about preventing unpredictability from spreading beyond its origin point. I asked him if he considered me unpredictable, and that question seemed to land differently than the others. He did not respond for a long time, long enough that I thought he might avoid it entirely. But then he said he had not yet determined whether I was unpredictable or simply unclassified. That distinction should have meant nothing to me, but it stayed with me longer than I expected. He stepped away from the window and returned to the table, this time closer than before, and said that everything in his world eventually became classified, because classification was how he maintained understanding. Then he looked at me directly and said I had not yet settled into any category he could use. I asked him if that was a problem for him, and he answered without hesitation that it was not a problem, but it was the first time something had not resolved itself through observation alone. When I left later that day, I realized that I was no longer being treated as someone passing through his environment, but as something he was still trying to define while I remained unchanged. I remember the moment everything stopped feeling like a series of separate meetings and started feeling like a continuous line I had already stepped onto without realizing where it began. When I arrived at the riverfront office that day, the sky was overcast, and the light coming through the glass walls felt muted, almost restrained, as if even the weather outside was adjusting to the atmosphere inside. Ethan Moretti was already there, but something about his presence was different this time. He was not waiting in the same way he usually did. Instead, he was standing near the window, looking out at the city with a focus that suggested he was not just observing, but processing something that had already reached a conclusion internally. When I entered, he did not turn immediately, and that small delay felt intentional, like he was deciding how to approach the conversation rather than reacting to it. When he finally faced me, his expression was calm, but there was a weight behind his attention that had not been there before. He asked me to sit, and I did, noticing that the space between us felt narrower even though nothing physical had changed. He began by saying he had reviewed patterns across every interaction we had shared so far, not just the content of my answers, but the consistency of my reasoning. He explained that in his world, consistency usually aligned with predictability, and predictability was the foundation of control. Then he paused and added that I did not align with that pattern. I asked him what that meant in practical terms, and he said it meant I could not yet be anticipated through conventional methods of assessment. I remember telling him that I was not sure I was trying to be anticipated at all, and that answer caused him to stop speaking for a moment longer than usual. It was not discomfort I saw in him, but recalibration, as if he was adjusting the framework he used to interpret people. He then asked me if I understood what it meant to exist in a system that required classification in order to function. I told him I understood the concept, but I did not believe people should always fit into categories to be understood. That response made the room feel even quieter, not because anything changed physically, but because I could feel his attention shift in a way that was more focused than before. He leaned slightly forward and said that most systems fail when they encounter elements that resist classification, because those elements disrupt the assumptions on which the system is built. I asked him if he considered me a disruption, and for the first time, he did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me for a long moment, not evaluating, not analyzing, but considering something that did not yet have a defined structure. When he finally spoke, he said I was not a disruption, because disruptions imply force, and I had not acted with force at all. He said I was something else, something that created uncertainty without intention. I asked him if uncertainty was something he could tolerate, and he responded that he could tolerate it, but he did not ignore it. Then he added that everything he built depended on minimizing uncertainty before it became instability. I told him I was not trying to introduce instability into anything, and he acknowledged that I was not trying to do anything at all in relation to him, which made the situation more complicated, not less. He stood up again and walked toward the window, speaking more quietly now, saying that the problem was not my intention, but my effect. I asked him what effect he meant, and he said that I was the first variable he could not simplify through observation alone. That sentence stayed in the air between us longer than anything else that day. When I left the building, I realized that I was no longer being evaluated as someone inside his world or outside it, but as something that existed in the space where his understanding of control stopped working as expected. I did not hear from Ethan Moretti for several days after that meeting, and the absence felt more noticeable than his presence ever did, not because I expected him to reach out, but because silence had started to feel like part of a pattern that was no longer random. I returned to my normal routine in Chicago, going between my part-time work and personal obligations, but even in ordinary spaces, I found myself noticing how differently I observed things since meeting him. Details that used to feel irrelevant now carried weight, not because they had changed, but because my awareness of how systems function had shifted. When the message finally arrived, it was shorter than any before it, just a request to meet at a neutral location downtown in the early evening, no explanation attached. I arrived at the address at exactly the time he specified, and for the first time, he was already seated at a table in a public space rather than a controlled private environment. The setting was a quiet lounge with large windows facing the city street, people moving in and out around us, conversations blending into background noise that made the space feel less isolated than before. Ethan did not stand when I approached, but he acknowledged my arrival with a simple nod, and for a moment neither of us spoke. When he finally did, his voice carried a different tone, less structured, more observational, as if the conversation was no longer about evaluation but about continuity. He told me he had been reviewing the way our previous interactions developed, not just the content of what I said, but the way my responses did not align with expected patterns over time. I asked him what patterns he was referring to, and he said behavioral predictability in environments where influence and hierarchy dictated most interactions. He explained that most people adapted quickly to perceived authority, adjusting tone, language, and intent depending on who was in front of them. I told him I was not sure I understood why that mattered in relation to me, and he responded that it mattered because I had not done it once. That statement created a pause between us that felt heavier than previous silences, not because it was emotional, but because it was precise. I asked him if not adjusting meant I was making a mistake, and he said it was not a matter of mistake, but of incompatibility with how systems like his maintain stability. I told him I was not trying to interact with his system at all, and that I was only responding when spoken to directly. That answer made him look away for a brief moment, as if considering whether my lack of intent was itself part of the problem he was trying to define. When he spoke again, he said that most variables in his environment either aligned or resisted, but I did neither in a consistent way that allowed classification. I asked him if classification was always necessary, and he responded that without it, control became uncertain, and uncertainty created risk. I told him I was not interested in being part of any system that required me to change who I was in order to be understood, and for the first time, he did not immediately analyze that statement or redirect it into a conceptual framework. Instead, he simply observed me for several seconds without speaking. When he finally responded, his voice was quieter, and he said that he was beginning to understand that I was not changing in response to him at all, which meant the adjustment was happening on his side instead. That admission did not sound like agreement or resistance, but something closer to realization. When I left that evening, I understood that the distance between us was no longer defined by access or authority, but by the fact that he was beginning to recognize something in me that did not conform to anything he had built his world around. I arrived earlier than usual that day, not because I expected anything different from Ethan Moretti, but because something about the way our last conversation ended stayed with me longer than it should have. The meeting location was another neutral space in downtown Chicago, a quiet business lounge with wide glass walls and minimal decoration, designed in a way that made everything feel temporary, as if nothing inside was meant to be remembered. Ethan was already seated when I entered, but this time he did not immediately acknowledge me. Instead, he was looking down at a tablet in front of him, reviewing something with slow, deliberate focus. I took a seat across from him without speaking, noticing that the silence between us no longer felt like distance, but like continuation. When he finally looked up, his expression was not analytical in the same way as before. It was more contained, as if he had already moved through several conclusions before I arrived. He asked me if I had noticed any change in how I was being contacted recently, and I told him that I had not, other than the scheduled meetings he had initiated. He nodded once, as if confirming something internally, and then told me that was intentional. I asked him what he meant by intentional, and he explained that after our last interaction, he had adjusted the way communication was structured around me, not to influence outcomes, but to observe whether consistency in environment would affect my responses. That statement should have made me feel like I was being studied more closely than before, but instead it made the situation feel clearer in a way I did not expect. I asked him if that meant he was testing me, and he responded that it was not a test, because tests required a desired result, and he was no longer certain what result he was expecting. That was the first time I heard uncertainty in his language without it being immediately corrected or controlled. I asked him if uncertainty was a problem for him, and he said it was normally resolved before it became visible, but in this case, it had not resolved itself. There was a pause after that, longer than usual, and I could feel that the structure of his thinking was shifting in real time rather than presenting a finalized conclusion. He then said something I had not heard from him before, that my responses were not changing in reaction to his adjustments, and instead the adjustments were beginning to happen on his side without intention. I asked him if that was something he considered a risk, and he said it depended on whether change without intention was still considered control or the beginning of something else entirely. I told him I was not trying to change anything about his environment or decisions, and that I was only responding honestly when spoken to. He looked at me for a long moment after that, not with analysis, but with something closer to reconsideration. Then he said that honesty, in its most consistent form, was the one variable he had not accounted for in environments built entirely on adaptability. I asked him what that meant for me specifically, and he admitted that he did not yet have a defined answer. That admission was different from anything he had said before, because it did not attempt to categorize or contain the uncertainty. Instead, it left it open. When the meeting ended, he did not give instructions or schedule another time immediately, and for the first time, I left without knowing whether I had been evaluated, observed, or something else entirely that he had not yet found a name for. I realized something had changed even before I saw Ethan Moretti again, because the silence between our meetings no longer felt like absence, but like preparation for something that had not been named yet. When I arrived at the downtown location that day, the atmosphere inside was noticeably different, not in structure or design, but in the way the space seemed to anticipate interaction rather than simply contain it. Ethan was already seated, but this time he was not reviewing documents or observing the environment. He was simply waiting, and that felt more deliberate than anything he had done before. When I sat down, he did not begin with questions, and that alone shifted the rhythm of everything that followed. Instead, he told me he had been considering the pattern of our interactions over time, not in terms of outcomes, but in terms of how his own responses had begun to deviate from expectation. I asked him what deviation meant in this context, and he said it meant that his usual method of categorization was no longer producing stable results when applied to me. I told him I was not sure why I would affect that process at all, and he said that was exactly the point, because nothing in his environment typically existed without producing predictable classification. There was a long pause after that, longer than any previous silence between us, and I could feel that he was not evaluating me in the same way anymore, but evaluating the framework he used to evaluate everything else. He then said something I had not heard from him before, that the system he relied on for understanding people and outcomes was beginning to produce inconsistencies when I was introduced into it. I asked him if that meant I was creating a problem, and he responded that it depended on whether inconsistency was defined as failure or as something unaccounted for. That distinction stayed between us longer than anything else he had said. He leaned back slightly and admitted that most variables in his world either adapted quickly to structure or were removed from it entirely. But I had not done either, and yet I remained present in every interaction. I told him I was not trying to resist anything. I was only responding honestly, and that honesty was not something I adjusted depending on context. He looked at me for a long moment after that, and instead of responding immediately, he asked a different question, whether I understood that consistency and truth could still create instability in systems built on expectation rather than reality. I told him I understood the concept, but not why it mattered to me specifically, and he said it mattered because I was the first person who had not altered themselves in response to his presence or influence. There was no immediate reaction after that statement, only stillness, as if he was allowing the weight of it to settle without interference. Then he said something quieter, almost detached, that if nothing about me was changing in response to him, then something about him was changing in response to me instead, and that this outcome was not something his environment had been designed to accommodate. I asked him if that concerned him, and for the first time, he did not frame his answer in terms of control or risk, but in terms of observation, saying it did not concern him yet, but it was no longer something he could ignore. When I left that day, I realized that the space between us was no longer defined by authority or distance, but by the fact that he was beginning to recognize that I was not adapting to his world, and instead his world was beginning to register me as something it had not been structured to understand. I did not expect the next meeting to feel different before either of us spoke, but the moment I entered the room that day, I could sense that something had already shifted beyond what words could easily contain. The location was the same neutral downtown space overlooking the city, but Ethan Moretti was no longer treating it like a controlled environment for observation. He was already seated when I arrived, yet this time his attention was not fixed on anything external. It was directed inward, as if he had been continuing a thought long after it had stopped being theoretical. When I sat down across from him, there was no immediate question, no structured analysis, only silence that felt deliberate in a new way, less like evaluation and more like conclusion forming in real time. After several moments, he finally spoke, and his voice carried a steadiness that was different from before, not because it lacked control, but because it no longer seemed to rely on it in the same way. He told me he had spent time reviewing not just our conversations, but the way those conversations had changed the way he processed information about everything else around him. I asked him what that meant, and he said it meant that the framework he had always used to interpret people and outcomes was no longer producing consistent results when applied across all variables. I told him I was not sure why I would affect that, and he responded that it was not about cause in the traditional sense, but about the fact that my presence did not resolve into any category that allowed him to predict behavior in advance. There was a pause after that, longer than usual, and I noticed that he was not trying to correct the uncertainty anymore. Instead, he was allowing it to exist without immediately restructuring it. Then he said something that felt like a turning point, that in every system he had built or observed, inconsistency was either corrected or removed, but in this case, inconsistency was not disappearing, and it was not correcting itself either. I asked him if that meant I was a problem he could not solve, and he said it was not a problem, because problems implied an intended solution, and there was no longer a defined solution for this situation. That answer should have created distance between us, but instead it created a different kind of focus, as if the absence of a solution had replaced the need for control. He leaned forward slightly and said that for the first time, he could not determine whether the correct response was to adapt the system or to question the system itself. I told him I was not asking him to change anything, and he nodded once, acknowledging that without argument. Then he said something quieter, that the issue was not what I was doing, but what I was not doing, because I was not reacting to him in the way every other variable in his environment had always reacted. I asked him if that meant he wanted me to react differently, and he said no immediately, almost too quickly, and then paused before adding that he did not know what he wanted anymore, which was something he had never said before in any form. The silence that followed did not feel like uncertainty this time, but like recognition of something irreversible already in motion. He finally stood up and looked out at the city, saying that every system he understood was built on predictability, but I represented something that did not stabilize into predictability over time. I told him I was still the same person I had always been, and he said that was exactly the point, because I had remained constant while everything around me, including his own perception, had begun to shift. When I left that day, I understood that the boundary between observer and participant had dissolved without either of us deciding it should, and that Ethan Moretti was no longer measuring me against his world, but beginning to measure his world against the existence of me. I did not hear from Ethan Moretti for several days after that final meeting, and for the first time since this entire sequence began, the silence did not feel like anticipation or evaluation, but like distance that had not yet decided whether it was final or temporary. I returned to my normal routine in Chicago, moving between work and home, but even in ordinary moments, I found myself noticing how differently I now understood the idea of structure in people and in systems. Nothing around me had changed in a visible way, but my awareness of how control operated in the background of everything had shifted in a way I could not reverse. When the message finally arrived, it was not a request to meet at a controlled location or a structured environment. It was simply an address, no explanation, no time specified, only a location on the edge of the city near the river where the boundaries between business and isolation felt less defined. I arrived just after sunset, and the building was quieter than any place we had met before, almost empty, as if the space itself had been cleared intentionally rather than simply unused. Ethan Moretti was already there, but this time he was not seated or waiting in a structured position. He was standing near the glass wall that faced the river, and for a moment he did not turn when I entered. I could see him clearly from behind, and there was something unfamiliar in the way he held stillness, not as control, but as thought without resolution. When he finally turned, there was no question, no analysis, no structured inquiry. Instead, he simply looked at me as if confirming that I was real in a way that no longer required testing. I sat down without being asked, and the silence that followed was different from all the previous ones we had shared. It was not evaluative, and it was not uncertain. It felt final in a way that had not yet been defined. After several moments, he spoke, and his voice was quieter than before, not weaker, but no longer shaped by the need to maintain structure. He said that he had spent time understanding not just my responses, but the effect my presence had produced across every system he used to interpret people and outcomes. I did not respond immediately, because something about the way he spoke suggested that interruption was no longer part of the process. Then he said something that felt like the conclusion of every conversation we had ever had, that the system he relied on to define predictability no longer produced the same results when I was part of it, not because I had changed, but because nothing about me had aligned with the conditions required for classification or control. I asked him what that meant now, and for the first time, he did not attempt to translate it into structure or strategy. Instead, he admitted that he no longer knew whether the system needed adjustment or whether the system itself was incomplete from the beginning. That admission did not feel like uncertainty in the way it had before. It felt like acceptance of something he could no longer reverse. He looked at me for a long time after that, and said that in every environment he had ever built or understood, stability had always come from removing unpredictability, but I had remained unchanged long enough that unpredictability had stopped being something to remove and had become something to understand. I told him I had never intended to change anything about his world, and he nodded, saying that intention was no longer the relevant factor. Then he said something that stayed with me longer than anything else he had ever said, that for the first time in his life, he was no longer adjusting the world around him to maintain control, but adjusting his understanding of control itself because of one constant variable that had never aligned with expectation. When I left that night, I understood that nothing about our interaction had been about influence or power anymore, but about the moment a system realizes it was never complete, and that realization did not come from force or disruption, but from something as simple and irreversible as honesty that refused to change.